Welcome to Echo Veins. I had imagined the day so differently. 80 years was no small triumph, and I thought there might be laughter, perhaps a toast, maybe even a quiet moment where my son would thank me for the sacrifices that shaped his life. Instead, as the last candle flickered on the cake, Mark stood before me with a smile that carried no warmth. "I've sold the house," he announced, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. The words lodged in my chest before I could breathe them in. My house, my sanctuary, the walls I had painted, the rooms echoing with lullabies and arguments, birthdays and funerals, all gone in a single sentence. I stared at him, searching his face for some sign of jest, some shred of the boy I had raised. But there was nothing, only triumph, cruel and deliberate. And then I saw him, the buyer, a tall man with cold eyes, standing in the corner as though waiting for his cue. He stepped forward, extended his hand toward no one in particular, and spoke my name. Not loudly, not softly, but with a strange ownership, as though he had purchased not just bricks and beams, but the very essence of me. The room fell silent. Family, neighbors, acquaintances, all frozen, watching me unravel. I felt the weight of their eyes, the unspoken pity and whispered judgments already forming on their lips. My legs trembled beneath me, but I refused to fall. Humiliation clawed at my throat, demanding to escape as tears, but I swallowed them back. It struck me then with brutal clarity. To my son, I was not a mother, not a woman who had given him life, but a burden to be traded, discarded, erased. And as Richard, the buyer, held my gaze with that unsettling claim in his voice, I realized this was not the end of a celebration. It was the beginning of a reckoning. That night's sleep was a stranger to me. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, and every time I closed my eyes I heard him again. Richard. The way he spoke my name. It wasn't casual, it wasn't polite. It was a claim, a declaration that I belonged to him as much as the deed he held. His voice lingered like a shadow that refused to leave my chest. I searched my memory for him, desperate to pin his face to some fragment of the past. Nothing came. He was not a neighbor, not an old friend of my late husband, not a face from the parish or a former colleague. He was a ghost who had stepped into my life with knowledge he should not have had, with confidence he had not earned. That unsettled me more than the sale itself. At dinner, Mark introduced him as if unveiling a trophy. "Richard will be the new owner," he said, pride swelling in his chest. Carla's hand curled around his arm, her nails gleaming under the chandelier, and her smile carried the arrogance of a conqueror. My family was parading my defeat, dressing it up as progress. I was not a mother in that moment. I was the carcass they had carved their meal from. The betrayal burned deeper because it was not only Mark. It was Carla's complicit smirk, the approving nods of relatives who dared not speak against him. I felt stripped of dignity, left with only the raw ache of loss. And still, Richard's voice haunted me. He knew my name too well, as though it had been rehearsed. That thought kept me awake until dawn, my mind whispering one question over and over. Who was this man really, and why did it feel like he had been waiting for me all along? I wept in silence, the kind of weeping that leaves no sound, only a tremor in the chest and a wetness on the pillow. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. Grief is private, and mine was a storm I let rage only when the house fell still. Lily had been there that night, my granddaughter with eyes once so soft toward me. She would not meet my gaze as the announcement unfolded. Her lashes fluttered down, and she clutched her phone as if it might shield her from my humiliation. I wondered if she was ashamed of me, or worse, ashamed to be tied to a family that would betray its matriarch so brazenly. Michael's absence stung more than I admitted to anyone. My brother's son had always warned me in quiet tones, greed breeds vipers. He had seen in Mark what I refused to see. His absence that evening was a kind of prophecy fulfilled, and I cursed myself for ignoring his foresight. As I lay awake, memories attacked me like phantoms. My husband's sudden death, the long nights when I worked 2 jobs, scrubbing floors by day and sewing by night. Every sacrifice I made was stitched into that house. The wallpaper I chose when I could finally afford it, the oak table I bought secondhand but polished until it gleamed. These were not just objects. They were proof that I had survived, that I had built something from nothing. And yet, they had turned my survival into spoils. Mark had not only taken the house, he had transformed my life's labor into currency for his ambition. To him, My endurance was an inheritance to be stripped and sold. The grief was unbearable, yes, but something else began to bloom beneath it. Not hope, not forgiveness, something darker. A seed of rage pushing against the soil of sorrow, determined to claw its way toward light. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling my heart hammer like a war drum. Grief had broken me open, but what was rising inside me was no longer grief at all. It was the beginning of hunger. The weeks that followed were a slow unmasking. At first, I believed it was only Mark's cruelty, a single act of selfishness, but betrayal rarely travels alone. It festers, it gathers, it multiplies in the dark. Carla's sister, Diane, was the first shadow I uncovered. She had always hovered on the edges of our gatherings, her laughter too sharp, her eyes too calculating. I began to remember fragments. Her whispers to Mark when they thought I wasn't listening, her hand brushing his shoulder with the entitlement of family not by blood, but by influence. Later, I learned she had been feeding him advice for months, stoking his ambition, convincing him that I was nothing more than an obstacle to his future. And then there was Richard. The name that had clawed at my memory finally found its root. He was tied to my late husband's failed business partner, a man whose betrayal had once nearly destroyed us. I had buried that name decades ago, thinking time had sealed it in the past. Yet here he was again, resurrected through his kin, reclaiming not just my home, but the dignity I thought I'd secured through survival. They did not want property alone. They wanted to erase me, to scrub me from the story entirely. Even Peter, my other son, betrayed me by absence. He stood behind Mark, not out of loyalty but cowardice, choosing silence over confrontation. In his stillness, I heard the echo of abandonment as loud as any betrayal. But what gutted me most was Margaret, my church friend, my confidant, the woman who held my secrets in prayer. She had known. She had heard whispers and chosen not to tell me. Her silence was a betrayal sharper than words. Every familiar face became a mask, every mask hiding a predator. I realized I was surrounded not by family, not by friends, but by a circle of conspirators. And yet, in the darkest corner of my grief, I felt the strangest flicker. If they could plot together so carefully, so ruthlessly, then why couldn't I? The day Richard moved in, I walked through my own front door not as an owner, not even as a guest, but as an intruder. He greeted me with a nod too casual, as though I were some forgotten relative drifting by out of habit. Then, with a hand that lingered far too long on the frame, he gestured for me to step inside. My living room, my sanctuary. Yet every step I took echoed with a foreign weight, reminding me that I no longer belonged. Every painting on the wall, chosen in lean years when money was scarce but beauty was still a necessity, was now his. The rug I had scrubbed raw after Lily spilled juice on it when she was 5 was his. Even the scent of lavender polish I had used faithfully seemed to mock me, perfuming a space that no longer welcomed me. Outside, neighbors gathered in their doorways, their pity whispering like wind. She lost everything. I heard one say, words carried easily through the still air. I clenched my jaw, my shame paraded as though it were sport. And then Mark appeared, standing tall with Carla at his side, his arms snug around her waist. He looked at me not as a son looks at a mother, but as a ruler gazes down at the conquered. His grin was victory carved into flesh. I felt naked before him, stripped of dignity by the very child I had birthed. Yet humiliation is not only destruction, it is alchemy. In the crucible of shame, I felt something else stirring. Beneath the ache, beneath the sting, steel began to harden in my veins. They thought I was powerless. They forgot that the deepest wounds create the sharpest weapons. And they had just placed mine in my hands. I began quietly, as all storms do. My grief had been loud, but revenge required silence. I reached out to Michael, my nephew, the only one who had not dipped his hands into the family's rot. He came to me without hesitation, his eyes carrying the same fire I felt in my chest. In him, I found not only an ally but a mirror, someone who understood that blood ties meant nothing when poisoned by greed. Together, we dug into Richard's life. It was not hard to find the cracks. His history was littered with lawsuits, unpaid debts, and partnerships that dissolved in whispers of fraud. He carried enemies like shadows, too many to count, each one waiting for the right moment to strike. Mark, in his arrogance, had shackled himself to a man already doomed. My son had not sold my house to a savior but to a vulture, one whose wings were already broken. I studied them like a hunter stalking prey. Every movement, every habit became part of my silent ledger. Carla's greed was insatiable. Designer clothes arriving in boxes she hid in the garage, bank accounts drained as quickly as they were filled. Diane's arrogance left trails everywhere. Emails, careless words, the kind of overconfidence that begged to be used against her. And Richard's pride swelled larger than his fortune, his need for recognition blinding him to the pitfalls beneath his feet. For the first time in months, I felt something other than grief. I felt alive, sharp, carved into something new. Forgiveness was a word that had no place in my mouth anymore. I hungered not for peace but for justice, and justice had finally found its roots in me. The seed of revenge had been planted, and with Michael at my side, I was ready to watch it grow into something they could never escape. What they mistook for an old woman's silence was, in truth, the sound of their reckoning beginning to breathe. One by one, I began to move the pieces. Revenge is not loud. It is meticulous. It is the careful hand that shifts a single stone and watches the avalanche follow. The first strike was simple. Anonymous letters, carefully worded, delivered to Richard's creditors. Each one pointed them to truths they had ignored. Missed payments, false guarantees, silent partners vanishing into the night. I imagined his face as the phone calls began, as men in suits arrived with demands instead of pleasantries. The buyer of my house was now the hunted, debt clinging to him like fire. Next was Carla. Her greed had always been a ravenous thing, one she thought she hid in the glow of screens and the safety of passwords. But greed leaves trails, and I followed them. I watched as her indulgences surfaced, gambling apps, subscriptions hidden from Mark, luxuries that bled their bank account dry. I did not expose her with fury but with precision, one statement at a time, each truth laid bare until her perfect image cracked. Diane fell easiest. Arrogance blinds the careless. She whispered schemes in offices where walls had ears, and I made sure those ears passed her words along. A small recording in the right inbox, a file labeled with her name. And suddenly the woman who thought she ruled the shadows was drowning in exposure. The family that once preened before neighbors now stumbled under the weight of scandal. The pitying glances that once pierced me turned on them instead. I saw the whispers shift. Did you hear? Did you know? And I savored each syllable. Mark grew desperate. I saw it in his shoulders, no longer squared but sagging beneath invisible chains. His empire of arrogance was collapsing, brick by brick, and he could not see the hands dismantling it belonged to me. I never accused, never raised my voice. Silence was my sharpest blade. They never suspected the fragile old woman they had discarded could be the storm tearing them apart. And as I watched the first cracks spread wider, I realized the knife I had turned was only the beginning of the bleed. It happened faster than I could have dreamed. When the first stone slipped, the rest followed with merciless speed. Richard's creditors closed in like wolves, stripping him of everything he had flaunted. Cars repossessed, accounts frozen, his swagger reduced to frantic phone calls that no one answered. The man who had once spoken my name as if he owned it now could not even command his own future. Carla fled next. She had clung to Mark while the champagne flowed and the money gleamed, but when the accounts ran dry, she vanished with the last of their jewelry and a trail of perfume. I imagined her slipping away under cover of night, heels clicking toward a richer conquest. Her loyalty had always been measured in luxuries, and now there were none left to buy her love. Diane's collapse was public. I heard whispers of a meeting, a recording played in front of her colleagues, her schemes laid bare in the very office she once ruled with venom. She was dismissed in disgrace, her reputation bleeding out across the city faster than she could bandage it. And then there was Mark, my son, who once stood over me with glee as he stripped me of dignity, now sat among ruins. His house repossessed, his reputation scorched, his family scattered. He had thought himself untouchable, but I watched him unravel, his shoulders bent, his face hollow. He had traded me for ashes. I did not watch with glee. Satisfaction, yes, but grim and heavy. I had not lifted a blade, had not shouted for revenge. Karma had always been circling, and I had only given it the map. And yet, as I stood in the quiet, I knew the story was not finished. The fall was only half the punishment. The other half was still coming, for me. As their empire collapsed around them, I felt both relief and sorrow. Revenge had been a fire that kept me alive, but fire does not heal. It only burns until there is nothing left to consume. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against my chest, reminding me that justice may silence a wound, but it never truly erases the scar. Lily came back to me first. My granddaughter appeared at my door, eyes swollen, cheeks streaked with the remnants of shame. She fell into my arms without words at first, only sobs. Then came her broken apology for her silence that night, for looking away when I needed her most. I held her tightly, feeling the fragile rhythm of her heart against mine. In her, I saw the possibility of something untainted, a chance for the next generation to rise free from the poison of their parents' greed. Michael reminded me of what I already knew, but needed to hear aloud. Justice isn't just vengeance, he said softly. It's survival. His words sank into me like a stone into water. I had survived. That was my true victory. Not the downfall of those who betrayed me, but my refusal to vanish with them. And yet, as I looked at the ashes of what had once been my family, I felt the hollowness beneath the triumph. Betrayal is not a clean wound. It lingers, festers, leaves marks deeper than flesh. Their destruction had freed me, but it had not restored what they had taken. Justice had carried me this far. But in the silence that followed, I found myself asking, what does a mother become when vengeance is all that remains? On my 81st birthday, I stood in the garden of my new home. It was small, with peeling shutters and soil that had not yet learned the rhythm of my hands, but it was mine. Every blade of grass, every cracked stone in the path belonged only to me. No contract could strip it away. No child could barter it for their own gain. I breathed in the air of ownership, crisp and clean, and felt something I had not felt in years, safety. Richard's voice no longer haunted me, but it had not vanished. It lingered like an echo, a warning etched into my bones. The way he once spoke my name, as if it were property, had become a vow I carried with me. Never again would I allow anyone to speak my name as though it belonged to them. My name, my life, my story, they were mine to keep, mine to wield. I thought of what betrayal had carved out of me. It had stripped me bare, torn away the illusions of love and loyalty, but in the emptiness it left behind, I discovered something harder, sharper than grief. Strength. A strength forged not in comfort but in fire, born from the ashes of humiliation and betrayal. Mark believed he had sold my house. In truth, he had sold something far more precious. His soul, his honor, the last fragile thread that tied him to me. He had thought he was profiting, when all along he was burning himself to cinders. And I, the mother he had cast aside, had risen from those ashes. As the sun sank behind the trees, I closed my eyes and whispered my own name. Not as a victim, not as a possession, but as a survivor. Piece by piece, I had taken back what was mine. And this time, no one would ever take it from me again.